We all know that the climate is changing now as a result of human activity. However, the Earth has gone through many natural changes that I want to explore in this video. The climate has been changing over time on our planet, as far as we can tell, since the formation of our planet. We know this because scientists who study paleoclimatology can look at these changes in tree ring cycles, determine more recent changes for trees that have long lifespans like sequoias, and look at the gases that are trapped in ice cores for slightly longer time spans. These scientists can look even farther back by analyzing sedimentary rocks to look at the history of climate on the planet, way past from what data is available from trees and ice cores. What we've learned is that climate change, when occurring naturally, is a relatively slow process. We do have examples of the climate changing quickly, however, due to natural causes. For example, there were rapid climatic changes that resulted from the asteroid impact that caused the extinction of the non avian dinosaurs. Don't feel too bad about that because that extinction opened up multiple niches for mammals, which at the time of the dinosaurs were small shrew like creatures. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, these mammals diversified into what eventually led to, well, you. These sorts of environmental changes result in massive habitat changes. This is an example of an episodic and random climate event. They occur at irregular intervals and are more or less unpredictable. There are ecological disturbances that are periodic, meaning they occur relatively frequently and are more or less predictable. Grassland ecosystems, for example, see naturally occurring fires approximately every 5 years. Now, we'll come back to these a little later in the video, so I want you to keep these sorts of periodic changes, especially in grassland ecosystems, in the back of your mind as we continue through this video. When these sorts of climate changes happen, organisms really have three options. Organisms must be able to alter their behaviors, move to a different region, or, well, perish. There is one common adaptation that many species have evolved to deal with seasonal changes. For example, many species of birds will migrate south for the winter and return back for the summer. But it's hard to call seasonality a disruption. One of the more recent natural changes that has occurred is the end of the last ice age, which ended about 11,000 years ago. That change was more or less due to slight changes in the Earth's orbit that resulted in the polar ice caps getting a little bit more sunlight, causing the ice to melt and change the climate. What I want to point out now, though, is just because the Earth has changed in climate naturally over its entire lifespan doesn't mean the climate change that we are observing due to anthropogenic forces isn't serious. See, climate changes in Earth's history have happened relatively slowly, even the fast ones from the dinosaurs. What we're seeing now is rapid change. Change that's happening so quickly that we've never observed before, and we don't really know what's going to happen to our ecosystems and our biosphere, or even any Earth system. That's why we take climate change seriously, and it's why you're going to have an entire unit on it later on. Part of the good news is that many ecosystems are rather resilient in the face of ecological disturbances that are, well, comparatively mild in scale. This sort of resiliency thinking is growing in the ecological lexicon. Scientists like to think of the functioning of an ecosystem like this rolling ball model. Every ecosystem is resilient to certain disturbances like fires or major storms, floods, droughts, and other relatively minor disturbances. The key to understanding this concept is the threshold. or the amount of damage an ecosystem can withstand before the species composition and functioning of the ecosystem irreparably changes. Major changes in biodiversity can, of course, occur from these climate changes, but sometimes seemingly minor changes in the energy flow and species composition of an ecosystem can have large repercussions. In one of the most impactful papers ever published in the field of ecology, famed zoologist Robert Payne wondered what would happen if he removes a top predator from a shoreline ecosystem. He removed Pisaster, a type of sea star. What he observed was a paradigm shift in ecological thought. The biodiversity present in the plots of land where the sea star was removed saw biodiversity drastically lower. What that starfish did was control the population of other predators and certain bivalves. Without the sea star present, the best competing species quickly took over the landscape and excluded the other species. We call species like this sea star a keystone species. A keystone species is a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend on, such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. One more species concept you should be familiar with is an indicator species. When studying the health of an ecosystem, there are particular species a scientist would look for to get a quick idea of the health and quality of an area. Species with a narrow ecological tolerance curve are useful to scientists because they are intolerant to polluted or degraded ecosystems. In many pond and river ecosystems, for example, if the nymph stage of a stonefly or dragonfly are found, scientists know the ecosystem is healthy because these species cannot survive in polluted and degraded areas. On the other hand, if species like sludgeworms and maggots with a wide tolerance curve are found in the absence of those nymphs, it's an indication that the ecosystem may be damaged in some way and may warrant further study. So we've looked at changes in environmental conditions and biodiversity in the context of disturbance. But there is also an expected progression in how ecosystems change over time as they develop. Ecological succession is the gradual process by which ecosystems change and develop over time. Let's take a look at this expected process. Let's say we have an area that is totally barren of living things, a fresh start. Very resilient organisms that have few habitat requirements will colonize this bare rock. Lichens are an example of one of these species, and lichens are a composite organism. That's actually not one species. They arise from algae or cyanobacteria that live among multiple fungal species in a sort of mutualistic relationship. These communities secrete chemicals that break down rock in a process we call biological weathering. This weathering is further aided by the mechanical weathering we've learned about before, as water and wind further break down the rock. This is the first step to soil formation. As this happens, and as small layers of soil are built, other hardy plant species like perennial flowers and grasses will begin to colonize the area. We call these organisms pioneer species. which are the first to colonize barren environments. As these organisms live, die, and decay, they continue to contribute to the nutrient content and depth of the soil. After some time, there's enough soil to support larger plants like shrubs. This process of decaying plants continues to build depth and soil quality until softwood trees like evergreens can establish. These trees continue the soil building process. Eventually, these species give way to hardwood tree species that outgrow and outshade the shrubs and evergreens, resulting in a climax community. A climax community is the final stage of succession, remaining relatively unchanged until destroyed by an event such as a fire or some sort of human interference. What's interesting to note is that climax communities have slightly less biodiversity than transitional communities preceding them. This is because many of the understory grasses, flowers, and shrubs and pines are outshaded by hardwood species like maples and oaks, which are better at competing for light and nutrients. We call this process of ecosystem development primary succession. The successive changes in ecosystem structure occurring in an environment in which new substrates, devoid of vegetation and other organisms, usually lacking soil, such as a lava flow or area that came from a retreated glacier, is deposited. Now, what if a disturbance like a fire, burns through the climax community? Well, the soil is still there, and a similar process begins. Secondary succession is a type of ecological succession in which plants and animals recolonize a habitat after a major disturbance like a flood or fire. The two biggest differences between primary succession and secondary succession is that secondary succession begins without the need to begin the soil formation process. The soil is already there. So, as a result, it happens much quicker. Remember earlier when I said to keep fires in grassland ecosystems in the back of your mind? Now, what would you expect to happen to a grassland ecosystem if frequent fires didn't occur? Ecosystems like grasslands and savannas would eventually give way to a forest community. These sorts of ecosystems actually are adapted to and rely on frequent ecological disturbances. Now, because humans generally prefer fires not to happen uncontrollably, we suppress natural fires, and instead do controlled burns in these ecosystems in about the same frequency as it would happen naturally. So don't always think of an ecological disturbance as inherently bad for an area. Some ecosystems rely on these sorts of disturbances. And now it's time for our first, a closer look. I brought you here today because Indiana Dunes National Park is a spectacular example of succession happening right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a journey from the beach and deeper inland so we can see succession occurring in front of us and observe the changes. Here at the beach, we begin our succession hike. Here we see the first step of succession. Weathering due to wind and water has broken rock down into sand. Though you can't see it now, bacteria and lichens also help to further break down this raw material. But more importantly, as they live and die, they incorporate organic material into the soil. That's the first step of soil formation. This weathering and slow incorporation of organic material continues as the hike brings us further in and brings us to the foredune area. Here we begin to see plant life. Sand grasses like this marram grass here are pioneer species. They are very hardy species that can withstand the consistent disruption here. They do two important things. Their super long roots stabilize the sand and stop it from moving around. As the plants die and decay, they continue to add more organic material into the soil. This marram grass here is evidence that soil quality is building in bulk and nutrients, as this particular species of grass is not quite as hardy as other sand grasses. Even here, we're further helped along by the lichens and mosses, which continue to break down more raw material, contributing to the soil quality. We also begin to see an increase in animal species as many insects begin to colonize here. However, because we're still near the beach, this area sees consistent disturbances and will pretty much remain in this state.
Moving farther along, we come to an area that is dominated by shrubs and small trees like this cottonwood. Here, the greater diversity of plant species create complex root systems that hold the soil in place even better than the grasses from the foredunes. Because there are more plants growing, there's even more organic material being incorporated into the soil. Because of all these plants, this community supports a greater amount of animal life.
As the soil quality continues to build and more nutrients are available, we see a pine community develop. Because these trees grow larger and produce a lot of shade, many of the plants from the earlier community cannot compete here, and thus a pine community is established. Here we see trees with much more intense nutrient requirements, like these jack pines and spruces. Now we arrive at a much older community. This is an oak-dominated forest, but we also see some smaller tree species here like basswood, dogwood, and witch hazel. All the leaf litter from these trees piles up every year and creates a deeper and richer layer of soil. And here we are, the climax community at Indiana Dunes. The dominant species here are going to be maple and beech, but there is also black oak, which is a species of oak that is particularly efficient at using the resources here and appears to be the most common tree that I am surrounded by. This is a relatively stable community and will remain present here until some sort of massive disturbance. Climax communities such as this one are relatively resilient in the face of minor disturbances like extreme storms or floods. However, if an out-of-control fire were to sweep through this area, it would revert back to an earlier stage and secondary succession would begin.